Greetings, Dark Elf Space Troopers, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
It's been a long time since we last did a mini retrospective, so let us undo this unforgivable and grievous error. Today, we want to take you on another trip through time, showing you the progression of a Warhammer 40,000 faction's basic troop miniature over the decades. This time, we're going to be taking a look at the Eldar Guardian. Would like to thank our friend Seamus of the Seamus Institute of Elf Studies for kindly donating all the miniatures you're going to be seeing in this video. It's okay, Shay, you can release the hostages now. We've made the video and I'm sure their families miss them.
Guardians are the militia of the Eldar craft worlds. See, it says so right at the top of their Lexicanum page. Made up of civilian Eldar who don the mesh armour and pointy helmet of a Guardian to go into battle as and when needed. The exception to this are the Black Guardians of Ulthwé, who are a standing army made of professional soldiers. Now, as always when we make a video like this, we are just looking at the Guardians because by focusing on the basic troops choice of an army, you can see the design sensibilities that spiral out into the range as a whole over time. Also stops the video from being over 2 hours long, since as fun as it would be to make a video about every single Eldar miniature, we would prefer that videos take less than 6 months to make. Although if we were to do a full line history video, the Eldar wouldn't be the hardest option considering how long some parts of that line have stuck around for. Like, this is the current Viper jetbike mini, which is also the original Viper jetbike mini. Anyway, let's get into it. But first, if you are watching this video, you're probably into Warhammer 40,000. You may even be watching it on a phone. So how about you combine those two things with this video's sponsor, Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. The game is a fast-paced, turn-based tactical game, I guess that's why they call it Tacticus, where you assemble teams of champions from 18 playable factions from the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Although she's one of the ones you get early on, my favourite character so far has been Vindicta, because her capacity to set everything on fire, including your own troops, is very useful when dealing with things like scarab swarms. I just need to remember to move my guys out of the way more often. You can fight with or against other players, and the game is constantly being updated, so there's always something new. In fact, the Emperor's Children will be coming to the game in August as part of the game's 3rd anniversary. And to sweeten the deal, if you use code JULYHELLO, you'll get 50 free Blackstone and 20 energy. If that all sounds good to you, then please download Tacticus from the link in the description.
In the primeval days of 40k, there weren't any Eldar Guardians, or at least no unit called Eldar Guardians, but the precursors to them were knocking around, so let's take a look at them. March of 1987 brought a range of pre-Warhammer 40,000 Warhammer 40,000 miniatures, some of which would later be folded into the main 40k line, some of which wouldn't. In that range was the Dark Elf Space Trooper, a spindly little critter who is either wielding a webgun or a particularly aggressive vacuum cleaner. It's unclear. However, as strange as its weapon might look, many elements from this mini would carry over to the later Eldar miniature range. The helmet, which should never be viewed in front profile lest you embarrass him, has the hints of the conical shape that would define the Eldar armour aesthetic. There's also the chainmail looking mesh, which, though much more prevalent here, would be an element present in much of the early Eldar range. Hell, it's even been pointed out that the weird giant neck pillow it's wearing does bear a passing resemblance to what a warp spider's got going on. Or I suppose the raised part on the shoulders of more modern Guardians.
Once Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader was actually released in September of 1987, the Eldar would get a proper miniature line, RT-04, although presumably because no one knew what an Eldar was yet, the early miniatures were advertised under Space Elf branding, despite their actual name being established in the main rulebook. These minis were usually presented as pirates or mercenaries as, although the craft worlds were established, they weren't really a thing in the game yet. I mean, the Eldar craft worlds were in the main rulebook, but craft world Eldar as a force that you could fight with kinda wasn't, if that makes sense. Still, these early mercenary Eldar would get folded into the Guardian range later, so they can claim guardianship despite, technically, not being released as them. As it was early Rogue Trader, these initial Eldar minis had individual names. In this range, rather than being named after, I don't know, guns or Batman actors, their names would be something that was vaguely Celtic, followed by a compound word. So these two we have here are called Urbic Trueshot and Eowyn Fireheart. And already the Eldar template is taking shape. The conical helmet is now fully conicaled, they've got plate armour that's lighter than the stuff seen on Imperial Marines, and they've got those little oval bumps dotted all over them. However, there are a few things that separate them from modern Guardians. And not just because they're solid lumps of slightly toxic metal. For one, their armour is pretty bulky with pauldrons that are just a little too Space Marine-ish. Although, to be fair, there are others in the line that look more lithe and more conventionally Eldari, but we just don't have any of those. And there's the very bulbous lower legs that are not present on all the minis of the line, but are present on both of these. And then of course there's the weaponry. There wasn't really much separation of who used what in early Rogue Trader, so an Eldar could have, for example, a las cannon, and for that matter a Space Marine could have a shuriken catapult. It was all a bit of a free-for-all.
Still, as more minis came out in the Space Elf/Eldar range, elements of their design were refined. Their armour became sleeker, those elements they shared with Space Marines changed, and they started looking less like they've got a water retention problem in their legs. You can see all those early refinements here on Tal's Spellsinger, a musician mini from 1988. Around 1990 we got the next iteration of Guardian, which were, by this point, actually called Guardians. Like the previous ones we've looked at, they were still one solid piece of metal, but had a much simpler and refined look. This example is wielding a lasgun, which was their default weapon at the time, although up to half of your Guardians could be battle squads, which had shuriken catapults instead. We just, don't have any of those. As we're around 1990 though, it's time for the mandatory visit to everybody's favourite 1990 40k spin-off.
Space Crusade.
Well, okay, we're not looking at Space Crusade itself, we're actually looking at something from its 1991 expansion, Eldar Attack, which gave you the ability to play as the titular Space Elves, though technically these are not Guardians, according to the rulebook they're Eldar warriors.
Which is an important distinction if you wish to be incredibly pedantic. And I do. But if we are to live in a world where these are Guardians, then they'd be the first plastic ones, cast in a fetching baby blue colour, and in a slightly odd pose due to the swappable weapon gimmick we all know and love from many other Space Crusade miniatures. And if we accept that these are actually Guardians, because let's be honest, they absolutely are, then they'd also be the first to have a shuriken catapult be their standard weapon. There's no mesh undersuit here, it's replaced with what appears to be a cloth one, which highlights an unusual arse, which kinda makes it look like they have one unified cheek rather than two individual buttocks. Cowardice on the part of the sculptor, or important Eldar lore implication? You decide. Also, the pink underpants on my paint job are accurate to the Alay Mercenary Corps, so don't be sassing my boy for his fashion choices. Those pants are part of a proud warrior tradition. Probably. Leaving Space Crusade behind, 1991 would also bring a new brace of Eldar Guardians. Much like the Space Marines of the time, these would have metal bodies with plastic arms and weapons. The chainmail mesh was back, and these are more or less in line with the metal ones from 1990, stylistically speaking, just mildly posable in the way that solid lumps of metal aren't. Also, unambiguously female Guardian minis are a thing now, so that's neat. Incidentally, this is the only mini we're showcasing today from our collection that wasn't painted by me, just in case you're wondering why it looks a little different. Although I did touch up some paint chips and add some flock to the base since she was going to be put in front of all of you and you know what you're like.
Going into 2nd edition, many of the Rogue Trader Guardians would continue to be sold, but in 1994 a new variety would pop up. A new mainline plastic set of monopose Guardians, not totally dissimilar to the Space Crusade ones, with the body being one solid piece with a separate gun, but in a much more natural pose. These initially all came with lasguns by default, but later versions came with the option of metal shuriken catapults. Now, these obviously suffer from the usual monopose issue, i.e. when you have a bunch of them, it's very obvious that they're all the same guy. But there's also nothing particularly new going on with them stylistically, just a further refinement on the Guardian look. The one big difference being that from this point on, the chainmail mesh is finally gone. I don't know, they're solid little sculpts and we do appreciate them. They're one of the few plastic Eldar that don't feel like you could easily crush them in one hand, they're just not the most exciting. Also, it's a minor point, but this was the era the helmet was at its most upright and pointy, significantly higher mass than those early 1st edition Eldar. Eldar got a 3rd edition Codex in 1999, and although the actual book didn't contain any photos of them, it was released alongside a new set of Eldar Guardians miniatures, although even if they aren't in the book, art of the new design would still show up in it. This time, Guardians got a fancy multi-part plastic box you could easily pose and modify, similar to the previous year's Dark Eldar Warriors. There were 4 Guardians to a sprue, which explains why, however they were packaged, the regular guys were always in multiples of 4. Lasguns were finally officially gone from the options, and shuriken catapults were cemented as the official weapon for a Guardian. Well, aside from Storm Guardians, but we'll get to those later. And if you have any old ones that still have lasguns, let's just say they're weird-looking shuriken catapults.
As well as a greater clarity on the sculpts and further small refinements on the design, there's a couple of notable elements in here. For one, the little, wings, spines, whatever these things are that poke out on the back. They're here now. A design element that had shown up on things like the Eldar Dreadnought / Wraithlord for years, and had become a wider part of the Eldar aesthetic. Also, the helmet had undergone a fairly heavy redesign. The conical shape was kept, but it would be a little more swept back again, and the face would be entirely reworked to have a recessed faceplate without a mouth grill. One can only assume because it was realised that both Eldar and Space Marine helmets had basically the same face. There was also an unhelmeted head on the sprue that's not a bad sculpt or anything, but it is mildly notorious for looking a little funky once it's got paint on it, even on the studio miniatures. These Guardians were available for a long time, over 20 years, although they did repackage them a few times, hence why they used to be in boxes of 16, but by the end of their life they were 10 to a box, but 2 of those were from a separate heavy weapons platform sprue. Regular Guardians needed to be in multiples of 4, after all. Plus, their long shelf life meant that, given their modular nature, they were used as the basis for a few variants utilising additional metal or resin parts. Around 2001 there was the Dire Avengers upgrade that turned Guardians into, well, Dire Avengers, which made sense as Dire Avengers are, in game terms, just fancy Guardians. Although this wouldn't be around for very long as they would later get a dedicated kit to differentiate them more. However, whilst this was done as a Guardian upgrade, it was done mostly via the medium of a new helmet and hip adornments, both of which were cast in metal, giving the Mini a somewhat odd-feeling centre of gravity, one to put a penny in the base of, for sure.
And speaking of minis you might want to put a penny in the base of, in 2003 there was the Storm Guardian box. This was 8 regular Guardians with new weapons and heads to represent either the melee-focused Storm Guardian variant, or, if you happen to play Craftworld Ulthwé, the highly trained Ulthwé Black Guardians. These folks were available for quite a while, so you can find the extra bits cast in both metal and resin, depending on when they were made. The metal ones, again, feeling pretty unbalanced due to a light plastic body with all of its extremities being cast in heavier metal. But the fanciest was probably the 2011 Eldar Corsairs from Forge World, bringing the old piratical element of the Eldar that was prominent in 1st edition back to the tabletop in the form of a resin upgrade to the Guardian box. The wings on their jetpacks presumably being an intentional nod to this old piece of art of Eldar mercenaries from the 87 main rulebook. However, the 2020 version of the Wrath and Glory rulebook interprets them as back banners rather than wings, which... sure? Not to mention the grille around the lower face being very evocative of the early Eldar range. Admittedly, having winged jetpacks and a mouth grill while being armed with las blasters as a default weapon does kinda make this feel like off-brand swooping hawks. But you know when you prefer the off-brand version of something to the real one? Yeah,
Also, forgive me for putting this one on a larger, non-standard base. Probably never going to get another one of these, so I just wanted to make it look a little special. Oh, and this was one of those annoying kits where you needed to cut off some of the guns in order to put the new ones on. So, yeah, be warned, I guess. Although I'm not entirely sure where you're getting discontinued 2011 Forge World parts from. And if you've got a guy for that, then, you know, please hit me up. Now, there was also a small box of easy-to-build snap-fit Guardians released, although the exact date these were released is a little hard to pin down. Sometime around 2009 is about as close as we can say. And yes, I am aware of how silly it is that we can say down to the month when some Rogue Trader stuff came out, but something released in the last 15 years or so is apparently harder. But that's just how things are sometimes. Anyway, these were much simpler versions of the main box, akin to the 2nd edition monopose ones, but in the modern style. And after that we hit the modern 2022 Guardians box, which to a casual glance looks more or less identical to the 1999 box, but once you look a little closer you realise they are constructed completely differently. You don't have as much freedom with how you pose them, as is the current way of doing things, but on the upside they come with options for Storm Guardians right out of the box, they didn't need a package refresh to give you the heavy weapons platform, and they have a better variety of unhelmeted faces. And to be fair on the poses front, even though you've got less freedom, the default poses are much more varied, so we're not at all in 2nd edition monopose territory here. Also, they're no longer on 25mm bases like they've always been, but instead on those 28.5mm bases that still feel fake to me. Subtly too big or too small depending on what perspective you're looking from. I don't know, I just don't trust them. I feel like they're planning something.
So, that was a quick look at the Eldar Guardian minis over the years. In some ways, they've barely changed, their helmets just being more or less erect, with the minor details slowly refining as time went on, which is probably mostly down to the fact that the general look of the Eldar is very much down to one guy, Jez Goodwin. He had a very definite vision for the Eldar that got locked in hard once they stopped being random elf pirates and mercenaries, and the craft worlds were fleshed out. That's not to say that other sculptors and artists haven't worked on them, but Goodwin's aesthetic sensibilities loom large over the Eldar. All of the old minis we've looked at here were credited to Goodwin. Well, apart from the Dark Elf Space Trooper and Space Crusade ones, since we're not really sure who did those, and any of the later ones that are often a little murkier in their credit attributions are, at least, very much using his design language. Which is why, if you ever get a chance to look through the Eldar sketchbook that collects a bunch of his concept sketches for the faction together, definitely take a look. It'll give you a deeper appreciation for the little details on the miniatures. If nothing else, his labelled sketches are good for explaining what certain doohickeys on Eldar minis actually are. Oh hey, the dreads on a striking scorpion helmet are actually sensors. Huh. But for now, we hope you enjoyed this little trip through Space Elves' past.
Please let us know which kind of 40k Troop you'd like to see us do a mini retrospective on next. We've already decided what it'll be, so your answer won't change anything, but sometimes the illusion of control is almost as good as the real thing. Thanks to Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus for sponsoring this video. Follow the download link below to download the game, and remember to use code JULYHELLO for some free resources. Tell them Snipe and Whip sent you. Hello there, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please let us know with a like or a comment, or if you're new here, with a sub. We've got a few other videos just like this one on Space Marines, Chaos Space Marines and Necrons, not to mention dozens more on old Warhammer related nonsense. If you'd like to help support this channel in a more financial way, take a look at patreon.com/snipeandwhip, where for as little as $1 a month you'll not only help fund making this stuff, but get early access to videos, your name in the credits, and access to exclusive Patreon-only content. Until next time, cheerio.